Everybody loves a good comeback story. We see this as a narrative arc through almost every movie, every novel. We get this hero who starts off strong, maybe of humble origins, and then seems to be on the right track. And all of a sudden, this person goes through tragedy and difficulty, and it looks like it's not going to work out well for them. And then all of a sudden, something comes back again, and they bring back into good news and a good plan for them. This looked like my story as well. I grew up kind of in humble origins, pretty casually, but at age 18, it was clear that God was calling me to pastoral ministry. But shortly after that, I was involved in a number of things that I'll get into another time, but I was involved at 19 in a motorcycle accident. At 21, I deployed to Iraq and had an IED go off next to my vehicle. On top of that, I went through just a series of bad moral decisions in my early 20s that made it look like, wow, there's no way God could use Alan in pastoral ministry. It's the same thing for Joseph. As we're studying the life of Joseph, Joseph starts off humbly, but has favor over his life, then goes through some incredible tragedy, and we are in his story in Genesis, if you want to turn to it. And today we're going to be in chapters 40 and 41. The title of this message is Life of Joseph, From Prison to the Palace. In this series of events we see today, Joseph has just landed in prison, and it looks like the story should be over for him, but by the end of the story, he moves into the palace. We'll start in Genesis 39. We're actually covering about 80 verses today, so I will not be reading all of them, but be reading part of it and then talking through some of them. But we're starting as a recap in Genesis 39, verses 21 through 23. It says this, "But the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him. He granted him favor with the prison warden. The warden put all the prisoners who were in the prison under Joseph's authority, and he was responsible for everything that was done there. The warden did not bother with anything under Joseph's authority because the Lord was with him, and the Lord made everything that he did successful." As a quick recap, Joseph as a young man was very gifted. His father favorited him. We learned in Genesis chapter 37, and his brothers hated him. Jealousy and hatred was filled with his family, a lot of division, a lot of jealousy, and yet Joseph had favor on his life from God. We saw this bestowed on him. God gave him a couple dreams. Joseph decided to share his dreams with his brothers, and as a result, they took his coat, and they tried to take his life. They put him in a ditch, and ultimately they sold him into slavery, thinking that was the end of the story. But when we see God's providence over Joseph's life, Joseph was bought as a slave, but to a very prominent Egyptian named Potiphar. And Potiphar used him in an incredible way and gave him all the privileges to manage his entire house. Things were going great for Joseph. And yet come in Potiphar's wife. Potiphar's wife deeply desired to be with him. Joseph, being a righteous man, continuously over and over again said no in Genesis chapter 39. And that leads us to the prison. Potiphar's wife refused to take no for an answer, and when she could not have him, she lied that he raped her, and Joseph is now in prison. And yet again, just like the verses we just read, the Lord was with Joseph, and God made Joseph successful in everything that he did. There's a difference between worldly success and godly success, and when God is behind a person and gives them success, it will make all the difference in the world, and God will do some incredible things through this person named Joseph. And that leads us into chapter 40. You can see here how I'm going to break down the message today. We'll talk about chapter 40 with the two prisoners' dreams. Then we'll get into Pharaoh's dream in chapter 41, and then we see the results of that as well. And so chapter 40 is the intro into what's called the prison narrative. This is the section of the story where Joseph is in prison. So he started at age 17. Now he's at age 28. He has lived 9 years, presumably, in Egypt, and now he's in jail. And what we see here in chapter 39 is God was overtly working in his life. And now he's kind of opaquely working in his life, behind the scenes, but God is still there. And that so often is the case for many of our stories. There's times in our lives where we can see God clearly working, and there's other times where we're like, man, God seems distant and far away. But as we see in his story, he is very much at work. And we see this providentially in what happens in chapter 40. At the very beginning, the king of Egypt, Pharaoh, gets angry at a cupbearer and a baker and sends them to prison. And now Joseph, again, is assigned to all the prisoners and cares for them. And one day this cupbearer and baker come distraught and sad in verse 7. You know, one thing I think that stands out to me about this story, though, is Joseph has all the reason to be bitter, angry, and introverted. And yet in this story, look at verse 7. He says, "Why do you look so sad today?" Despite everything going on, he still prioritizes other people. He still cares for others. So if you don't know, a cupbearer is the ultimate last line of defense for the king. The cupbearer tastes all of the king's food and drinks all of their drinks to make sure that they are not poisoned or mistreated. And so he has a very high level of trust in his life. And this cupbearer first is the one that comes with a dream. In verse 8, he comes with a dream, and he has no one to interpret it. And Joseph says something incredible. "Don't interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." Joseph recognizes that all of his power, which we'll see later in this passage as well, all of his power comes from God, not himself. He has nothing to boast about. This is what a scholar, Matthews, says. Next slide, please. In ancient thinking, dreams were the prime vehicle of divine revelation. Joseph acknowledges this, but departs from the common view that professional magicians were required to interpret the official's dreams. Do not interpretations belong to God? Verse 8 of our story. God, who gave the revelation, could provide the interpretation to whomever he chose. Dreams were not the privilege of humans, but the domain of God. And we see this as Joseph shares the interpretation of this dream. And then we're also going to see this chief baker in a second. The chief baker is, again, he has an incredibly important role as well with Pharaoh. He's the one responsible for sustaining Pharaoh's strength. He bakes the goods that enter Pharaoh's mouth. He's the one that provides that. And so both the chief baker and the cupbearer have done something very bad, apparently, and the Pharaoh is furious with him. And so they are both in jail, and they both had a dream, apparently the same night, and they both have come to Joseph. And let's put up the next slide for me. Joseph interprets the dreams, and first off, the baker and the cupbearer share their dreams. And so we see some commonality between these two dreams. The cupbearer shares that he has a dream about a vine and 3 branches. And during this dream, the cupbearer has these grapes that are from this vine, and he goes and squeezes them back into Pharaoh's cup. That's his dream. The baker has this other dream, again with 3. There's 3 baskets of bread that are on his head. And this top basket has baked goods in it for Pharaoh. And yet Pharaoh does not eat this bread. Instead, birds eat it. That was the end of both of these guys' dreams, and they are both concerned and worried, and they have no one to interpret the dreams. And so Joseph shares the reality of this. He says for the cupbearer, these 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days, he prophesies, you will be restored back to Pharaoh. You will be restored back into your role. And Joseph ends with a request. But would you please remember me? Because I'm in jail and I've done nothing wrong. And so he asked the cupbearer, as a result, to put that truth in Pharaoh's ear and to remember him. And so then the baker hears this positive interpretation and says, oh man, I definitely want to hear Joseph. All right, Joseph's got something good for me. Well, as Joseph interprets the baker's dream, he says these 3 baskets also equal 3 days. But in 3 days, your head will be lifted up off of your body. Your body will be hung on a tree, and the birds will eat you as flesh. Wow, that's not what you want to hear. And yet Joseph was bold enough to know God's truth and give good news to the cupbearer's dream, but to give the challenging, demanding truth that not good things were coming for him. This reminds me of one of my favorite passages in the Gospel of John, chapter 1, where it says Jesus is full of grace and truth. Jesus absolutely loves everybody and gives everyone the free chance of accepting him as Lord and Savior and having a right relationship with God. And yet at the same time, Jesus is part of the Godhead, and he is holy and perfect and righteous. And anyone who does not accept Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, there will be punishment, and there will be an eternal separation between God and humanity for anyone who does not choose to believe in him. That's why the gospel is so amazing and filled with grace, but it's filled with an important truth that we must continue to proclaim and believe in our own life. And we see this reflected in these 2 stories. And so everything looks good for Joseph. And yet look at the end of chapter 40, verse 23. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Many of us in this room probably know what it's like to be forgotten. And Joseph very much saw this. Both of these men left the prison, one to his death, one restored, and Joseph was left for 2 more years. But the good news that we see in Joseph's story, and it's a truth for all of us, is sometimes people will forget about us, but God never does. God never forgets. He never leaves. He's always working if we trust in him. And character development is oftentimes the process how God continues to refine us. We see that in the New Testament, that God uses this example of gold, right? Gold is purified through fire. And that is what God does for you and for me. And he clearly is doing this with Joseph. Because as we'll get to, God has an incredible plan for Joseph where he's going to be in charge of an entire country, and presumably and arguably the entire region is saved through him. But he's not ready yet for that. God continuously needs to refine him and develop his character, and he's not done with that process. He is continuously in prison. I mentioned earlier that I served a year in Iraq. I deployed to Iraq in 2006 to 2007 and enjoyed my time there. It was a good experience. But you know, after living on this military base, it started feeling like a prison. Literally, it was surrounded by barbed wire. You could not leave. You could not go where you wanted to. And over time, that continuously started feeling more and more like prison, not only to myself, but to many of my fellow soldiers who commented about that as well. But what God did during that year of prison, God developed my character. I went through various trials and challenges, but ultimately God used that year of Iraq to develop my character, ultimately for ministry and serving him. Oftentimes I felt alone and misunderstood. I was one of the few people in my company that followed Jesus, but God had a plan through it. I love these two quotes from these amazing men that have served many years in ministry. A.W. Tozer says this: "It is doubtful whether God can bless a man greatly until he has hurt him deeply." Secondly, C.S. Lewis says, "God whispers to us in our pleasures. He speaks to us in our conscience, but he shouts in our pains." Many of us in this room who've lived some life would see that that is very much true. God oftentimes does have to wound us and give us trials in order to break us to submit to him. And through the trials, God oftentimes does shout in our pain. And those are the times where we really turn to God and ultimately grow and develop, just as Joseph has. So that leads us to chapter 41. Joseph now gets a chance to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. 2 years passed, and Pharaoh has his own dream. And this is very concerning for him, because as he shares his dream, he brings in the magicians of Egypt and all of his wise men, and nobody can interpret this dream. He has this dream of 7 very sick cows that you can see their skeletons because they are so famished. And these 7 sick cows eat the 7 healthy cows. It's a little concerning. Pharaoh has a second dream, presumably that night, where 7 unhealthy heads of grain are swallowed by 7 healthy heads of grain. And like I said, he brings his magicians in, he brings all the wise men, and nobody can interpret what is going on in this dream. This dream has significance because it's all referring to the Nile. The Nile was the source of Egypt's life, economy, and social stability. All came from the Nile and its rivers that flew through Egypt. It's the only thing that allowed this desert land to have any prominence. And again, what we see here is Pharaoh had 2 dreams. And these 2 dreams are of significance. These 2 dreams, again, we talked about this before, and it's spelled out in chapter 41 as well. When there's 2 dreams back to back, it's saying that God confirms this will surely happen, and it will happen soon. And then dream interpretation was very common in Egypt. Back then, all Egyptian pharaohs would have advisors who'd come and advise them on the dreams they would have to interpret them. And so after 2 years, when no one can interpret this dream, the cupbearer finally remembers Joseph. And Pharaoh immediately calls Joseph out of the prison to interpret this dream. And starting in verse 15 is when we see this happen. And Joseph clearly has been matured and has grown a lot. We see this in verse 15. Joseph says, "Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and no one can interpret it. But I've heard it said about you, and you can hear a dream and interpret it." But look what Joseph says in response in verse 16. "I am not able to," Joseph answered. Hold on a second, Joseph. You're not able to interpret a dream? Didn't you have 2 dreams to your brothers that you shared? Didn't you just interpret 2 dreams to the cupbearer and the baker? And they were clearly answered. Joseph, you got some clout, man. You got some gifts. Why can't you just brag about it and say, "Man, I got this. I got you, Pharaoh." Because Joseph has become humbled. And he recognizes that all gifts are ultimately not his. They are a gift from God. And that is so important for us to remember. And you can see if you go back to chapter 38, where Joseph is a younger man, he doesn't seem as humble. He goes and brags about how he's going to lead his brothers and his father. But what we learned in Matthew chapter 5 in the Beatitudes is God exalts the humble. The humble recognize that ultimately everything comes from God. And by relying on God, he lifts us up and uses us in incredible ways. This contrasts the world. The world in our society exalts the proud, the gifted, the braggers. But what in God's kingdom is a reverse kingdom. God exalts the humble. And we see this here with Joseph. It's a reminder to all of us to give God all the glory, honor, and praise from our life. It does not come from ourselves. Growing up, I doubt anybody would have looked at me and been like, man, that guy's going to be a pastor someday. I grew up in a home, we went to church maybe once a month. We never prayed, we never read the Bible, and I kind of did some crazy stuff as a teenager. But when I turned 18, I was like, you know what, there's something missing, and I started going to church regularly. But even then, the youth pastor looking at me, 18 years old, he never came to me and been like, Alan, I see something in you, let's develop that. I think one day God might be calling you to be a pastor. No, none of that was shown. That was further clarified for me when I was in college and I took a communication class. And I'm like, I got this. I don't even have to try very hard. I love communicating. I love doing all these things. I almost failed my communication class on speech, public speech. Just years down the road, as I engaged in ministry, it's the same thing. People looked at me and be like, Alan, I don't think you have that gift. But I'm like, I just feel this calling, like God's calling me to be a pastor one day and to preach. And many people will be like, Alan, I don't think that's your gift. But what I've learned over the course of years is that we should definitely pay attention to our gifts. But I've found, at least in my life, that we have to listen to something that supersedes our giftings. And that's our calling. Calling supersedes your giftings. We see that with Moses. God told Moses, go and tell my people and go to Pharaoh in Exodus and set my people free. And Moses says, not me. No way can I do that. I'm not gifted at talking. And God got frustrated with Moses, but I've called you. Go. Calling is so much more important. We see this in Joseph's life too. When Joseph had the gift of dream interpretation and went to his brothers and father, they all said, nah, man, you're crazy. You don't have those giftings. Let's see what happens when we throw you in jail. Let's see what happens when we sell you to slavery. Nothing's going to happen because you have no gifts. And what we see chapters later in chapter 41, he clearly had a gift. Proven in chapter 40. And now the person who is the highest ranking official in all the land, Pharaoh, sees this and says, you do have a gift because God has called him to it. But what's crazy here is he didn't just interpret the dream. He takes another step forward in faith and obedience, and he actually advises Pharaoh on what to do. Look at with me, chapter 41, verses 33 through 36. He says, so now, the final interpretation here, right? Two dreams, the same meaning. Joseph interprets the cows and the grains to mean this. Egypt will have 7 years of bountiful harvest. They literally, we'll see later, they will have so much grains that Joseph can no longer even count them. There's more grains coming out of Egypt than there are sands on the sea. And on top of that, after these 7 years of bountiful harvest, there will be an incredible and severe famine, not only in Egypt, but in all the land. That is Joseph's interpretation. But like I said, in verses 33 through 36, he not only interprets the dream, but he now goes to advise Pharaoh on what he should do. Pretty crazy. He's coming from prison. He's going up to the king and tells him what to do. It's like a convicted convict going up to our president and telling him what to do. He says, verse 33, so now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this. Let him appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the harvest of the land of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. Let them gather all the excess food during these good years that are coming, and under Pharaoh's authority, store the grain in the cities so that it may preserve it as food. The food will be a reserve for the land during the 7 years of famine that will take place in the land of Egypt. Then the country will not be wiped out by the famine. Joseph takes the risks here. He easily could have been appreciated by Pharaoh for the dream interpretation, but then Pharaoh would be like, who are you to tell me what to do back in the prison? And yet Joseph saw that God was with him, and he was successful in everything he did. And so Pharaoh looked at this convict and said, you know what? I'm going to promote you to number 2 in all of the land. And this is the story of how Joseph went from the prison to the palace. This is our last section today. Pharaoh, a non-believer, recognized that Joseph had divine power. We see this in verse 37. It says, their proposal pleased Pharaoh and all of his servants, and he said to them, can we find anyone like this, a man who has God's Spirit in him? Pharaoh does not believe in Yahweh, the one true God. He believes in many gods, and yet he recognized there's a divine power in Joseph. It's a good moment to question in our own lives. Can non-believers in our lives see that we're a Christian? Can they tell through our actions? Can they tell through our words? Can they tell through a supernatural joy and peace that surpasses all understanding that we are called to have? If not, then perhaps something needs to change in our own life. Verse 40, he says, you will be over my house, and all of my people will obey your commands. Only I as king will be greater than you. You know, this original language in verse 40, the original language of the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. Very different language than our own. I studied it and was pretty bad at it. But in verse 40, the original language in Hebrew says that literally the people will literally kiss your mouth. That's what it says in the original Hebrew in chapter 40. This is why we're thankful that we have modern translations that help us understand. Joseph will be fully blessed by all the people, and we see a physical result of that. In verses 41 and on, Joseph has gained a signet ring. He has fine linen clothing now. He's got a gold chain around his neck. And this is probably the coolest thing, I think. He's got a chariot. It's the second greatest chariot in all of Egypt. And he has an entourage of runners. As Joseph is in the chariot going throughout all the provinces of Egypt, literally the runners go around and say, make way for Joseph. Joseph has now been exalted up beyond all that he could have imagined. This is an external representation of God's favor on his life. Like the coat of many colors in chapter 37, he now has near infinite wealth and power. On top of that, Pharaoh gives him a new name. And this new name literally means God who speaks and lives through Joseph. The Pharaoh recognizes that Joseph has this divine power and God is speaking through him. This is what Matthew says about Egyptian religion that coincides with this. Next slide. It says this, in Egyptian religion, the living king of Egypt was the god Horus, or the son of Re, making his edicts inviolate. His chief role as the mediator between the gods and society was to maintain Mat, that is, order in the land. Because of the king's human limitations, it was necessary to delegate officials to represent him in the breadth of the land. And Joseph, bearing the symbols of Pharaoh authority, would oversee the grain industry. The expression hand and foot is a figure of merism, meaning that every activity must meet with Joseph's approval. Again, his sphere of dominance equates to all of the land. Joseph has now been exalted above and beyond all that he can ask for or imagine. And Joseph is now 30 years old. So moving from 17 until 30, you see, God had a plan for continuously elevating Joseph. He started humbly by all being in charge of at 17 was shepherding sheep. He moved to be in charge of all of Potiphar's house. In prison, he moved to being in charge of all of the prisoners. And finally, at age 30, God has exalted him to be in charge of an entire country. That brings us back to Ephesians chapter 3, verse 20. I read earlier during the announcements. Now to him who is able to do above and beyond all that we ask or think, according to the power that works in us. That's the good news of our God. We don't serve a weak God. We don't serve a small God. And we serve a God that wants to do more in us than we can ask for or imagine. But what limits us most of the time is our own faith and our lack of dependence on him. Joseph has now been elevated to this role, and what we see as a result in verses 47 through 57 is that this truly happened. 7 years of abundance, and literally it says that there was so much grain in the land that Joseph quit counting. In verse 49, it was like the sand of the sea. And then during the 7 years of famine, Joseph, with all the wisdom that God gave him, adequately cared for all of the people. And literally, as the Egyptians cried out for help, they all came to Joseph. And Joseph was the one that saved and restored all of Egypt. Some application for today. I love the way Charles Swindoll sums this up in a chapter of his book. He says, lengthy afflictions need not discourage us. When we go through trials and through hard times, as Joseph did from 17 to 30, he never gave up hope. For you and for me, when we go through trials and difficulties, do we give up hope, or do we have a faith that God is in the work of something greater? Number 2, bad memories need not defeat us. Joseph had reasons to be disgruntled, to hate life, to hate the people in his life, and to be discouraged. And yet Joseph never allowed his painful past of being sold into slavery to defeat him. God even gave him sons in chapter 41, and he named them names of how God forgave him and forgot all of his painful past and restored him. And lastly, great blessings need not disqualify us from service. Sometimes we feel like if somebody's wealthy or rich, that they have maneuvered and manipulated in a way to gain that. Or maybe inherently wealth is a bad thing. Well, not in Scripture. Now we see that the love of money is the root of all evil. But money itself, there's nothing wrong with it. Sometimes we can be suspicious of wealthy people in the church, maybe suspicious of how they gained that wealth. But when we see stories like Joseph, who had incredible amounts of wealth, all that came from the Lord, and yet he never took advantage of all of it. He used it to bless and serve others. And we can do the same with our own wealth. Whether it's a few thousands or a few millions, we can use our wealth for the advancement of God's kingdom.